book, Two Bits Amy. I'm back with another reading from Samuel Johnson's Lives of the English Poets, specifically, his life of Milton. So this will be labeled as part 3, and I've created a playlist. So if you've not yet listened to parts 1 and 2, you may go back in that playlist and listen to all the parts in order. So we're picking up on page 25 of the Folio Society edition, midway down the page. He now began to engage in the controversies of the times and lent his breath to blow the flames of contention. In 1641, he published a treatise of Reformation in 2 books against the established church, being willing to help the Puritans, who were, he says, inferior to the prelates in learning. Hall, Bishop of Norwich, had published a humble remonstrance in defense of episcopacy, to which in 1641 6 ministers, of whose names the first letters made the celebrated word Smichimenes, gave their answer. Of this answer, a confutation was attempted by the learned Usher, and to the confutation Milton published a reply entitled Of Practical Episcopacy, and whether it may be deduced from the apostolical times by virtue of those testimonies which are alleged to that purpose in some late treatise, one whereof goes under the name of James Lord Bishop of Armagh. And I apologize for stumbling over those words. It doesn't matter how many times I look them up. When I go to pronounce them, I find I stumble in my pronunciation. I have transcribed this title to show by his contemptuous mention of Usher that he had now adopted the puritanical savageness of manners. His next work was The Reason of Church Government Urged Against Prelacy by Mr. John Milton, 1642. In this book, he discovers, not with ostentatious exultation, but with calm confidence, his high opinion of his own powers, and promises to undertake something, he yet knows not what, that may be of use and honor to his country. This, says he, is not to be obtained but by devout prayer to that eternal Spirit that can enrich with all utterance and knowledge, and sends out his seraphim with the hallowed fire of his altar to touch and purify the lips of whom he pleases. To this must be added industrious and select reading, steady observation, and insight into all seemly and generous arts and affairs, to which in some measure be compassed, I refuse not to sustain this expectation. From a promise like this, at once fervid, pious, and rational, might be expected the Paradise Lost. He published the same year 2 more pamphlets upon the same question. To one of his antagonists, who affirm that he was vomited out of the university, he answers in general terms. The fellows of the college wherein I spent some years at my parting after I had taken 2 degrees, as the manner is, signified many times how much better it would content them that I should stay. As for the common approbation or dislike of that place, as now it is that I should esteem or disesteem myself, the more for that, too simple is the answer, if he think to obtain with me. Of small practice were the physician who could not judge, but what she and her sister have a long time vomited, than the worser stuff she strongly keeps in her stomach. But the better she is ever keeking at, and is queasy. She vomits now out of sickness, but before it be well with her, she must vomit by strong physic. The university, in the time of her better health, and my younger judgment, I never greatly admired, but now much less. This is surely the language of a man who thinks that he has been injured. He proceeds to describe the course of his conduct and the train of his thoughts, and because he has been suspected of incontinence, gives an account of his own purity. That if I be justly charged, says he, with this crime, it may come upon me with tenfold shame. The style of his piece is rough, and such perhaps was that of his antagonist. This roughness he justifies by great examples in a long digression. Sometimes he tries to be humorous, lest I should take him for some chaplain in hand, some squire of the body to his prelate, one who serves not at the altar only, but at the court cupboard. He bestow on us a pretty model of himself, and sets me out half a dozen pisticle, and there is a footnote, pisticle, feeble. So feeble mottos, wherever he had them, hopping short in the measure of convulsion fits, in which labour the agony of his wit, having scraped narrowly instead of well-sized periods, he greets us with a quantity of thumb-ring posies, and thus ends this section, or rather dissection, of himself. Such is the controversial merriment of Milton. His gloomy seriousness is yet more offensive. Such is his malignity, that hell grows darker at his frown. His father, Reading, I think that's probably meant to be Reading. His father, after Reading was taken by Essex, came to reside in his house, and his school increased. At Whitsuntide, in his 35th year, he married Mary, the daughter of Mr. Powell, a justice of the peace in Oxfordshire. He brought her to town with him, and expected all the advantages of a conjugal life. The lady, however, seems not much to have delighted in the pleasures of spare diet and hard study. For, as Philip relates, having for a month led a philosophical life, after having been used at home to a great house, and much company and joviality, her friends, possibly by her own desire, made earnest suit to have her company the remaining part of the summer, which was granted upon a promise of her return at Michaelmas. Milton was too busy to much miss his wife. He pursued his studies, and now and then visited the Lady Margaret Lee, whom he had mentioned in one of his sonnets. At last Michaelmas arrived, but the lady had no inclination to return to the sullen gloom of her husband's habitation, and therefore willingly forgot her promise. He sent her a letter, but had no answer. He sent more with the same success. It could be alleged that letters miscarry. He therefore dispatched a messenger, being by this time too angry to go himself. His messenger was sent back with some contempt. The family of the lady were cavaliers. In a man whose opinion of his own merit was like Milton's, less provocation than this might have raised violent resentment. Milton soon determined to repudiate her for her disobedience, and being one of those who could easily find arguments to justify inclination, published, in 1644, the Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, which was followed by the judgment of Martin Bucer concerning divorce, and the next year his Tetrachordon, expositions upon the 4 chief places of Scripture which treat of marriage. This innovation was opposed, as might be expected, by the clergy, who then, holding their famous assembly at Westminster, procured that the author should be called before the Lords, that the House says Wood, and there's a footnote on the word Wood, Anthony Wood, 1632 to 1695, antiquary in his Athene Oxienses. Says Wood, whether approving the doctrine or not favouring his accusers, did soon dismiss him. There seems not to have been much written against him, nor anything by any writer of eminence. The antagonist that appeared is styled by him a serving man turned solicitor, Howell, and there's a footnote telling us that James Howell, 1594 to 1666, author of familiar letters, mainly to imaginary people, which were written while he was a political prisoner in the Fleet prison. So Howell, in his letters, mentions the new doctrine with contempt, and it was, I suppose, thought more worthy of derision than of confutation. He complains of his neglect in 2 sonnets, of which the first is contemptible, and the second not excellent. From this time it is observed that he became an enemy to the Presbyterians, whom he had favoured before. He that changes his party by his humour is not more virtuous than he that changes it by his interest. He loves himself rather than truth. His wife and her relations now found that Milton was not an unresisting sufferer of injuries, and perceiving that he had begun to put his doctrine in practice by courting a young woman of great accomplishments, the daughter of one Dr. Davis, who was, however, not ready to comply, they resolved to endeavour a reunion. He went sometimes to the house of one Blackborough, his relation in the lane of St. Martin's le Grand, and at one of his usual visits was surprised to see his wife come from another room and implore forgiveness on her knees. He resisted her entreaties for a while, but partly, says Philip, his own generous nature more inclinable to reconciliation than to perseverance in anger or revenge, and partly the strong intercession of friends on both sides, soon brought him to an act of oblivion and a firm league of peace. It were injurious to admit that Milton afterwards received her father and her brothers in his own house when they were distressed with other royalists. He published about the same time his Areopagita, a speech of Mr. John Milton for the liberty of unlicensed printing. The danger of such unbounded liberty and the danger of bounding it have produced a problem in the science of government, which human understanding seems hitherto unable to solve. If nothing may be published but what civil authority shall have previously approved, power must always be the standard of truth. If every dreamer of innovations may propagate his projects, there can be no settlement. If every murmurer of government may diffuse content, there can be no peace. And if every skeptic in theology may teach his follies, there can be no religion. The remedy against these evils is to punish the authors, for it is yet allowed that every society may punish, though not prevent, the publication of opinions, which that society shall think pernicious. But this punishment, though it may crush the author, promotes the book, and it seems not more reasonable to leave the right of printing unrestrained. Because writers may be afterwards censored, then it would be to sleep with doors unbolted, because by our laws we can hang a thief. But whatever were his engagements, civil or domestic, poetry was never long out of his thoughts. About this time, 1645, a collection of his Latin and English poems appeared, in which the Allegro and Penseroso, with some others, were first published. He had taken a larger house in Barbican for the reception of scholars, but the numerous relations of his wife, to whom he was generally granted refuge for a while, occupied his rooms. In time, however, they went away, and the house again, says Phillips, now looked like a house of the muses only, though the accession of scholars was not great. Possibly his having proceeded so far in the education of youth may have been the occasion of his adversaries calling him a pedagogue and schoolmaster, whereas it is well known he never set up for a public school to teach all the young fry of a parish, but only was willing to impart his learning and knowledge to relations and the sons of gentlemen who were intimate friends, and that neither his writings nor his way of teaching ever savoured in the least of pedantry. Thus laboriously does his nephew extenuate what cannot be denied, and what might be confessed without disgrace. Milton was not a man who could become mean by a mean of employment. This, however, his warmest friends seemed not to have found. They therefore shift and palliate. He did not sell literature to all comers at an open shop. He was not a chamber milliner, and measured his commodities only to his friends. Phillips, evidently impatient of viewing him in this state of degradation, tells us that it was not long continued, and to raise his character again, has a mind to invest him with military splendor. He is much mistaken, he says, if there was not about this time a design of making him an adjutant general in Sir William Waller's army. But the modelling of the army proved an obstruction to the design. An event cannot be set at a much greater distance than by having been only designed about some time, if a man be not mistaken. Milton shall be a pedagogue no longer, for if Phillips be not much mistaken, somebody at some time designed for him to be a soldier. About the time that the army was new modelled, 1645, he removed to a smaller house in Holborn, which opened backwards into Lincoln's Inn Field. He is not known to have published anything afterwards till the king's death, when, finding his murderers condemned by the Presbyterians, he wrote a treatise to justify it and to recompose the minds of the people. He made some remarks on the articles of peace between Ormond and the Irish rebels. While he contented himself to write, he perhaps did only what his conscience dictated, and he did not very vigilantly watch the influence of his own passions and the gradual prevalence of opinions, first willingly admitted and then habitually indulged if objections, by being overlooked, were forgotten, and desire superinduced conviction. He yet shared only the common weaknesses of mankind, and might be no less sincere than his opponents. But, as faction seldom leaves a man honest, however it might find him, Milton is suspected of having interpolated the book called Icon Basilic, which the Council of State, to whom he was now made Latin Secretary, employed him to censor, by inserting a prayer taken from Sidney's Arcadia and imputing it to the king, whom he charges in his Iconoclastes with the use of his prayer as with a heavy crime, in the indecent language with which propensity had emboldened the advocates for rebellion to insult all that is venerable or great. Who would have imagined so little fear in him of the true all-seeing deity, as immediately before his death to pop into the hands of the grave bishop that attended him, as a special relic of his saintly exercises, a prayer stolen word for word from the mouth of a heathen woman praying to a heathen god. The papers which the king gave to Dr. William Juxon, 1582 to 1663, Bishop of London, the last person to whom Charles I spoke. The papers which the king gave to Dr. Juxon on the scaffold, regicides took away. Regicides took away, so that they were at least the publishers of this prayer, and Dr. Birch, who had examined the question with great care, was inclined to think them the forgers. The use of it by adaptation was innocent, and they who could so noisily censor it, with a little extension of their malice, could contrive what they wanted to accuse. King Charles II, being now sheltered in Holland, employed Salmasius, professor of polite learning at Leyden, to write a defense of his father and of monarchy, and to excite his industry, gave him, as was reported, 100 Jacobuses, Jacobuses being 20-shilling pieces. Salmasius was a man of skill in language, knowledge of antiquity, and sagacity of embendatory criticism, almost exceeding all hope of human attainment, and having by excessive praises been confirmed in great confidence of himself, though he probably had not much considered the principles of society or the rights of government, undertook the employment without distrust of his own qualifications, and, as his expedition in writing was wonderful, in 1649 published his Defensio Regis. To this, Milton was required to write a sufficient answer, which he performed, 1651, in such a manner that Hobbes declared himself unable to decide whose language was best or whose arguments were worst. In my opinion, Milton's periods are smoother, neater, and more pointed, but he delights himself with teasing his adversary as much as with confuting him. He makes a foolish allusion of Salamis, whose doctrine he considers as servile and unmanly to the stream of Salmachus, which whoever entered left half his virility behind him. Salmasius was a Frenchman and was unhappily married to a scold. To a Gallus, says Milton, et u, and we're getting into some Latin there. I'm just going to skip down, or maybe that's French there, that last bit. But it translates, according to the footnote, to "you are a French cock, and as they put it, too henpecked." But his supreme pleasure is to tax his adversary, so renowned for criticism and vicious Latin. He opened his book with telling that he has used persona, which, according to Milton, signifies only a mask, in a sense not known to the Romans, by applying it as we apply person. But as Nemesis is always on the watch, it is memorable that he has enforced the charge of solecism by an expression in itself grossly sophistical. And then, for one of those supposed blunders, he says, as Kerr, and I think someone before him has remarked, and there is another phrase in Latin, which translates to, I hand you over to the teachers of grammar for a flogging. From vapulo, which has a passive sense, vapulandus, can never be derived. No man forgets his original trade. The rights of nations and of kings sink into questions of grammar if grammarians discuss them. Milton, when he undertook his answer, was weak of body and dim of sight. But his will was forward, and what was wanting of health was supplied by zeal. He was rewarded with £1,000, and his book was much read, for paradox, recommended by spirit and elegance, easily gains attention, and he who told every man that he was equal to his king could hardly want an audience. That the performance of Salmus was not dispersed with equal rapidity or read with equal eagerness is very credible. He taught only the stale doctrine of authority and the unpleasing duty of submission, and he had been so long not only the monarch but the tyrant of literature that almost all mankind were delighted to find him defied and insulted by a new name, not yet considered as anyone's rival. If Christiana, as it was commended, the defense of the people, her purpose must be to torment Salmus, who was then at her court, for neither her civil station nor her natural character could depose her to favor the doctrine, who was by birth a queen and by temper despotic. That Salmaeus was, from the appearance of Milton's book, treated with neglect, there is not much proof. But to a man so long accustomed to admiration and a little praise of his antagonist would be sufficiently offensive, and might incline him to leave Sweden, from which, however, he was dismissed, not with any mark of contempt, but with a train of attendants scarce less than regal. He prepared a reply, which, left as it was imperfect, was published by his son in the year of the Restoration. In the beginning, being probably most in pain for his Latinity, he endeavors to defend his use of the word persona, but, if I remember right, he misses a better authority than any that he has found, that of Juvenal in his forced satire. And I'm just going to pause here because there is a portrait of John Milton on the page here. And then we have here a quote in Latin, which translates to, "What do you do when the person is detestable and more infamous than any charge could claim?" As Salmaeus reproached Milton with losing his eyes in the quarrel, Milton delighted himself with the belief that he had shortened Salmaeus's life, and both perhaps with more malignity than reason. Salmaeus died at the Spa, September 3rd, 1653, and as controversists are commonly said to be killed by their last dispute, Milton was flattered with the credit of destroying him. And I think we will pause there as we're about 25 minutes in. So there is an account of Milton's marriage. You do wonder just how bad that household or early marriage experience was, that his wife took off after only a month of living with him. You would assume that it was her reputation and the reputation of her family, perhaps, that drove her to come and ask for his forgiveness. So we have an account of his marriage and an account of some of his early controversies and controversial writings. And we will pick up here on page 33 of the Folio Society edition in part 4 next time around.